This video was brought to you by Skillshare. A couple of weeks or so ago, there was hope in SNP circles that this election would be a redeeming moment for the party. Despite a series of scandals and chronic infighting, the SNP's support never really dropped below 30% in the polls, and even a couple of days before the election, there were polls suggesting that they could eke out a victory against Labour and hold on to more than 20 seats. However, in the end, that's not how things panned out, and thanks to their lowest vote share in over a decade, the SNP won just 9 seats, down 80% from 2019. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what's gone wrong for the SNP, whether they can recover, and what this means for Scottish independence. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by taking a look at the election results. At the previous election in 2019, the SNP, under then leader Nicola Sturgeon, won 48 out of the 59 Scottish seats in the House of Commons, with Boris Johnson's Conservative Party coming second with just 6 seats. Back then, when Labour were led by Jeremy Corbyn, they actually came in 4th in terms of seats, winning just 1, while the Lib Dems won the remaining 4. However, this time around, things turned out rather differently. The Labour Party apparently reclaimed their dominance in Scotland, winning 37 of the 57 seats available, while the SNP won just 9, the Lib Dems 6, and the Conservatives 5. This was a massive win for Labour, who had dominated Scottish politics up until the SNP's arrival on the scene in the 2010s. In fact, the SNP's rise in Scotland wasn't just bad news for Labour because it deprived them of the 40 or so seats in Westminster, but also because at least until recently, it made an outright Labour majority unlikely, which meant that the Conservatives could tell voters that if you vote for Labour, you'll get a Labour-SNP coalition, which will mean another independence referendum and more chaos. This is something that Cameron and co effectively weaponised during the 2015 campaign, when they ran posters with Labour leader Ed Miliband in the pocket of SNP leader Alex Salmond, who now runs the Alba Party. Now, this election result was clearly terrible for the SNP, who have dominated Scottish politics really since the 2011 Scottish parliamentary elections, and it's their worst result at a national election since the 2010 general election. So, how did this happen? Well, the first thing to say here is that it's important not to overstate the severity of this collapse, and a lot of this is to do with first past the post. The SNP still won 30% of the popular vote, only 5 points behind Labour. And because a lot of seats in Scotland are toss-ups between the SNP and other parties, if the SNP had taken just a few more votes off Labour, they could have easily tripled their seat tally. It's also worth noting that this isn't entirely a negative story about the collapse of the SNP. There's also a positive story to be told about Scottish Labour, who are led by the remarkably popular Anna Sarwar. In fact, at this election, Scotland was the only place where Labour significantly increased their vote share, which remained broadly flat in England and actually fell in Wales. Nonetheless, caveats aside, it's still true that the SNP's vote share fell by 15% between 2019 and 2024, going from 45 to 30%. And their low turnout also suggests that they were unable to mobilise their base anywhere near as effectively as they've done in previous elections. So, what's gone wrong for the SNP here? Well, at first glance, you might assume that the collapse of a party called the Scottish Nationalist Party might have something to do with public appetite for Scottish independence. But polling suggests that that's not really true. Support for Scottish independence has actually held relatively steady at about 45%, and an Ipsos one from June actually gave Yes a 2-point lead. Rather, as we see it, the SNP's decline is down to 2 things: the SNP's questionable record when it comes to public services, and the chronic infighting we've seen since Sturgeon stepped down. Let's start with the first though, their record on public services. Despite spending more per capita on basically all public services, NHS waiting lists in Scotland are at record highs, and Scotland's education system has been performing particularly badly since COVID, at least as judged by PISA scores. And as voters' priorities have shifted away from the question of independence towards more mundane questions about the quality of public services, this has hurt the SNP electorally, and it's plausibly one of the factors behind their underperformance at last week's election. But the other big thing is constant infighting.
Now, we've done a whole load of videos on this before, but basically, since Nicola Sturgeon's resignation in March of last year, which was quickly followed by her arrest a few months later, the SNP have been beset by infighting between the more socially conservative and more socially liberal wings of the party, represented by Kate Forbes and Humza Yousaf, respectively, at the subsequent leadership election. Now, Yousaf won that election, but only narrowly, and stepped down about a year later when the SNP's power-sharing deal with the Greens fell apart. Yousaf was quickly succeeded by Deputy First Minister John Swinney. Now, Swinney isn't as socially conservative as Kate Forbes, whose stances on gay marriage and abortion upset a lot of the more liberal parts of the party, but he's still probably on that side of the party. And his pledge at the manifesto launched last month to, quote, turn the SNP into a moderate left-of-centre party in the mainstream of Scottish public opinion was widely interpreted as a slight against the left of the party and their myopic focus on niche issues to do with culture and identity. So, on to the last part of the video. Can the SNP actually recover? Well, while Swinney's pivot towards bread and butter issues is in a sense pragmatic, it does mean that the SNP are now occupying very similar political territory to Labour. The SNP are basically a nationalist Labour at this point, while Labour are a unionist SNP. Whether this works will really depend on two things. One, whether Labour can deliver better public services, which would squeeze out the space for the SNP, and two, whether or not independence rises up voters' agenda. At the moment, this feels unlikely. Given the urgent attention required by the UK's crumbling public services, the logistical difficulties introduced by Brexit, and the fact that the Conservatives, who are uniquely unpopular in Scotland, are no longer in power in Westminster. But the unknown variable here is Labour's devolution policy. Last time they were in power, Labour confidently claimed that their devolution policy, which basically involved creating devolved assemblies for the nations, would, quote, kill independence stone dead. Now, obviously that's not how things panned out, but Labour's devolution policy today is clearly designed to decentralise power without stoking nationalist sentiment by devolving powers to sub-national regional authorities. But whether this can both assuage Scotland's demands for autonomy without making Westminster look redundant is still an open question.
Running a profitable online news brand that gives away free content is a little tricky. So recently we launched an online store where you can purchase copies of our magazine, Too Long. The thing is, setting up an e-commerce business is also pretty tricky. But fortunately, when it comes to websites and e-commerce, Skillshare is there to help. With me taking their very useful course, Shopify Essentials for Web Developers, when setting up the store. That's because Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. That means that Skillshare can help take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. There's hundreds of career-focused classes. That's courses from how to start a business to maximizing your workflow or digital marketing. The best news is that the first 500 people to use our link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. So get started today.